I thank our NMPs for tabling this important motion and the members who have spoken during this debate. Many of you spoke passionately from your heart and from many personal experiences, especially Madam Rahayu, whom I also thank for proposing additions to the motion, which I support. SPS Senior Pausek Faisal, Second Minister Indrani, they will address and discuss many of the issues raised by you. But amidst all these ideas and suggestions raised, I thought it is useful for me to speak on the key principles of the Singapore's education system. Last week, Mr. David Brooks, he wrote a piece called The Paradox of Gender Divide. He observed that in the Nordic countries, where gender equality is the highest, many women exercise their choice and opt out of the corporate rat race. So the greater the gender equality, the fewer the number of corporate managers, female corporate managers, and that's the paradox. In education, we encounter similar paradoxes too, and I think there are at least two. The first paradox is that of meritocracy. Meritocracy recognizes talent and ability over wealth and circumstances of birth. It motivates society to work hard. It encourages us to develop our talents and put our talents and strengths to good use. And this approach has uplifted many families over the decades. Many members of the House would have benefited from this approach and this philosophy. And as families do well, they spare no effort, and they do well, they believe in meritocracy, and therefore they spare no effort investing in their next generation, including enrichment classes from a very young age. Hence, children today from more affluent families are now doing better from those from lower income families in school. Unlike the first generation of Singaporeans, where students are mostly from humble backgrounds, the next generation is pushing off blocks from different starting points. And students from affluent families have a head start. So meritocracy, arising from a belief in fairness, seems to have paradoxically resulted in systemic unfairness. And that's the question we all ask ourselves. There's a second paradox, and that is of inequality. When I was young, most of my classmates, including myself, we are all from humble backgrounds. So just by the sheer law of probability, some of us end up as top performers in school, but there's sheer law of probability. Today, the percentage of students from similar backgrounds are much smaller, and it continues to shrink. 10 years ago, about 20% of our employed households had an income of $3,000 or less at 2017 dollars. Today, that has gone down to well below 15%. And I think it will continue to shrink as we continue to uplift families. So this is a happy outcome. But as we successfully uplift more poor families, the smaller group of families that remain poor are facing increasingly difficult challenges. Their challenges are also translated to their children's performances in school. So as we uplift poor families, the greater the achievement gap between the rich and poor in school. And that's the second paradox. And as we confront these paradoxes, we question if our policies and approaches have run their course, and perhaps it is time to slaughter some sacred cows, take a fundamentally different approach. It depends on which cows you are thinking of slaughtering, I think. For some, maybe. For some, the answer, I think, is no. Paradoxes make us think hard about our challenges and our choices, but we can resolve these apparent contradictions. You take the gender divide debate in Nordic countries. They provided more equal opportunities to men and women, but women chose not to be like men. And so there's no contradiction in both greater equality and fewer female corporate managers. And how do we deal with the two paradoxes I mentioned, or that of meritocracy and that of achievement gap? So let's start with meritocracy. It is in danger recently of becoming a dirty word. A couple of education-related controversies arose in the US recently. The first is a lawsuit filed against the University of Harvard for systemic bias against Asians over the years. It was alleged that Asians, who tend to score the highest in the admission test for Harvard, they were marked down by the university on soft criteria, such as personality. So it's not just Singaporeans that is kiasu and study a lot. When Asians are overseas in the US, they too study very well and ace their exams. And apparently Harvard did this to preserve ethnic diversity in their university. The second controversy was the mayor of New York recently suggested to scrap the highly competitive admission examinations for 8 of the city's specialized public high schools. 62% of students in these schools are Asians, who tend to perform well again in those examinations. So this move by the mayor of New York will reduce the number of Asians, increase the number of Black and Hispanic students being admitted into these specialized high schools. Some ideas that we have come across in recent weeks, I must say not from this house, but from what we read, are along the lines of what the US schools are doing. There was a suggestion that we set a quota for low-income students in popular schools. I'm not in a position to comment on the admission policies for US schools, but Singapore's circumstances are different and unique, and we cannot assume that we will have to eventually do what other countries like the US have done. Many of our popular schools, and I think Professor Mohan have mentioned, they are making extra efforts to attract eligible students from low-income families, encouraging diversity amongst the students, mingling of students from different backgrounds. And we should encourage them to do more and try even harder. But setting a quota, I think, is sent a wrong signal. I don't think it's aligned to our societal ethos, and it can even be seen as patronizing. Another common suggestion, and that was raised, is to scrap the PSLE, one of the sacred cows. I will admit, PSLE is far from a perfect system, and it does add stress, a lot of stress sometimes, to parents and students, and the minister too. But it happens also to be the most meritocratic and probably the most fair of all imperfect systems. If we scrap it, whatever we replace it with to decide on secondary school postings, I think it's likely to be worse. I came across 2 alternate systems recently. The Swiss, I was in Switzerland last month, they don't have the equivalent of PSLE. But neither do students have a choice on what secondary school to go to or to work towards to go to. They are simply assigned to the school nearest to their homes. I visited one of these schools, I spoke to the students, and they all go home for lunch because they say it's 10 minutes walk, 5 minutes walk, different directions, and then they come back to school. They didn't have a choice where to go to. However, in Switzerland, the affluent have a choice. They will pay to go to private schools. And in Switzerland, 7% of students attend private schools. Another system, Hong Kong, I visited them earlier this year. Some years ago, they did away with their equivalent of PSLE. But in its place, Hong Kong now uses school examination scores for P5 and P6. So each school have your own examination. They use P5 and P6 examination scores for each of this school and use it for posting to secondary school. Different primary schools have different standards, so they have come up with a device and a tool to harmonize and to normalize the standards so that they are comparable. So in this case, the stress is somewhat transferred upstream. And like the Swiss, there is also a thriving private school sector in Hong Kong, which accounts for nearly 30% of school intake. The Chinese Development Assistance Council, CDAC, which I chair, is a self-help group. It has a program called the Supervised Homework Group Program. Here, young volunteers, they will spend a few hours every week tutoring and helping students from low-income families for their homework. On surface, this is to help them with homework, but the unspoken objective is for the volunteers to act as role models for the children, for the students. So I thought the volunteers would be a very suitable group who should have their opinion heard. And so I asked them, do they think PSLE should be scrapped? They have no vested interest. They have gone through the education system themselves, and they are now helping poor students cope with schoolwork. So I thought, let us hear their opinion. On the education system as a whole, they have many different views. But on PSLE, the great majority disagree with scrapping it. Why? The common reasons they cite, they felt that PSLE can in fact motivate these poorer students to work hard, and there are resources to support the poorer students. One expressed frankly that we can complain that PSLE favors the rich, but the rich are better poised to prepare their children in whatever alternate system that is in place. They say support the weaker students more, but don't take away the PSLE. So I think it's not a straightforward matter. This sacred cow survived for some very valid reasons, but what I think we need to do, we must do, is to reduce the stakes of this examination. Make it less of a do-or-die examination that is so important as if it will determine your whole life, which it doesn't. And there must be many other ways that we can do this to reduce the stake of this examination. And one way I always talk about is to ensure a broader definition of merit, one that does not focus too narrowly on past academic scores, but recognizes a broad meritocracy of skills, given the various strengths and talents of our people. That, at the core, is the objective of Skills Future. And that is why pedagogy is changing in schools, which many members have acknowledged. It is more experiential, more applied, more exploratory. And there are many more pathways in the higher education sector leading into lifelong learning that Professor Randolph Tan talked about. We can't change the fact that the starting points of each child is different, but our system can ensure that they all run a good race and finish as well. Now let's talk about the second paradox, which is that of the achievement gap. The easiest way to close the gap is to actually cap the top. Some of the suggestions raised in public, such as banning tuition and enrichment classes, redistributing resources from popular to less popular schools, are pointing in that direction. Excessive tuition to the point of causing undue stress and killing the joy of learning is not good for the child. But I don't think capping achievements and limiting opportunities is the right approach either. It runs against a very fundamental philosophy of our education system. As the educators in MOE will say, they say in Chinese, 保底不封顶 means don't cap the top, uplift the bottom. Indeed, a good proportion, about 7.5% of students who live in 1 to 3 room HDB flat every year emerge as top PSLE performers. And there are many others with great non-academic strengths and talents, and we must continue to strive to help them develop their strengths to the fullest. MOE's resourcing of schools reflect this approach. The highest level of funding, about $24,000 per student, goes to the specialized schools, means Crest Secondary School, Spectra Secondary School, Northlight School, Assumption Pathway School. The next highest level of resourcing, about $20,000 and $15,000 per student, goes to normal technical and normal academic streams, respectively. A student in other courses in government and government-aided schools and in independent schools attracts under $15,000 of resources per student. In addition, MOE regularly rotates and ensures that our good-performing teachers and principals are well spread across different types of schools. Beyond resourcing of schools, further assistance are granted to students from lower income households. They come in the form of financial assistance schemes, bursaries, school meal programs, and also the Opportunity Fund. The Public Service Commission, PSC, also reaches out to students from different schools in a quest for diversity amongst government scholars. It has been paying special attention to applicants from low-income families. Students from 2 junior colleges, RI and Hwa Chong, they used to dominate the scholarship awards. But the situation is improving. In 2007, over 80% of PSC scholars were from these 2 JCs. In 2017, that percentage has come down. It's now 60%. The PSC is also adjusting its interview techniques. They recognize that students from poorer backgrounds tend to be less articulate. And so the Commission is assessing the students beyond their communication skills, but instead looking into the substance of what they say, their ideas, and their thinking. And as a result, we continue to see President scholars who come from humble backgrounds of outside the most popular junior colleges. In 2016, Lieutenant Natasha N. Lam Mei Sim became the first President's and SAF scholar from Pioneer JC. She's now studying in the US, and she's an Air Force C3 officer. At last year's President's Scholar Award ceremony, I said to Mr. Lee Tat Wei and his family, his parents, his father was a taxi driver, his mother was a part-time sales assistant. Tat Wei is also studying in the US, and when he graduates, he will join the Foreign Service. Our approach of lifting the bottom has other significant outcomes. First, what we used to regard as opportunities available to students from more affluent backgrounds are now broadly accessible. For example, most schools now organize overseas learning experiences. Schools are offering a wide variety of CCAs. Let me give you a few examples. Tangling Secondary School has fencing as a CCA. Kentridge Secondary School offers sailing. North Vista Secondary School offers string ensemble, and Northlight has for many years now run the equestrian program. The Junior Sports Academy is another example. It's a 2-year free sports development program for talented and interested P4 and P5 students. The Academy does not scout for high-performing athletes and sportsmen or sportswomen. They look for raw diamonds, students with good motor skills and hand-eye coordination abilities, and then help them develop their sporting skills through professional coaching. So since 2017, we have doubled the capacity of the program to about 800 a year. Some students from the program, and Mr. Rajaram may be happy to note this, have gone on to gain places in secondary school through the DSA. And they did not go to those expensive coaches with high rates. This is done by the JSA free of charge. And MOE is now in the initial stages of developing a similar program for the arts. It is a good example of the alternate system we discuss and what will happen if we don't have PSLE. And you have alternate system. DSA is an alternate system. Mr. Rajaram has correctly pointed out the affluent, they always have a way, whatever system there is, to make better use of it. But in this case, that system also serves those from humble background, and we are able to train them to enter the top and popular schools. So we ask ourselves, are we better off with or without this alternate system? And I think it may well be better off having this system that can enable students from humble background able to enter popular schools. Notwithstanding, affluent students will also be able to make use of it. The second significant outcome is smaller class sizes for weaker students. The additional resources for specialized schools I mentioned and students in normal streams, they come partly in the form of additional teaching resources. So in Crest Secondary School, Spectra Secondary School, Northlight School, Assumption Pathway School, the typical class size is 20. In lower primary, learning support programs are done in groups of 8 to 10. Many normal technical classes are now taught also in sizes of 20, or they have a class size of 40, but 2 teachers. In many junior colleges, consultations between students and teachers, often one-to-one. For sessions with an education and career counselor or guidance, students meet one-on-one or in very small groups. There is sometimes still the perception that students study in one class and it is of a certain size. The reality and the lived experience of students is that they now regularly move around, join different groups, and there is no single class size. But let me put MOE's position on class size straight and clear. With good teachers, smaller class sizes help the students. Our teachers can attest to that through first-hand experience. In fact, I think there was a suggestion by Ms. Kwik Shaoyin to do a study. Actually, we are convinced. With good teachers, smaller class size help the students. It's quite clear. Why then is MOE cautious on the issue of class size? Because how it is implemented makes all the difference. Let me cite you the results of a few studies to illustrate this. They are done in overseas, in an overseas context, but nevertheless, these are scientific studies, and we should take note of the results. 2009, Hong Kong did a study on small class teaching in primary school. It puts about 700 classes through an experiment over 3 years, varying their class sizes along the way. The study found that, however, they varied the class sizes. There were no significant differences on performance compared to the territory-wide averages. What Hong Kong did find was that where an experimental school or class did significantly better, it was because the principal was more experienced, took an active role in developing the curriculum, developing the teachers, and involved the parents in education. And those were the key drivers of better performances. Another study was done by the Taub Center for Social Policy Studies in Israel, and results was published in their 2016 annual report. Unlike the Hong Kong study, the Taub Center did not conduct an experiment. They gathered a large volume of data on students' results and did a multivariate analysis on the key determinants of the results, with a special focus to find out if class size made a difference. The conclusion was in the first page of the report on the study, which said, I quote, "No significant relationship was found between class size and achievement," unquote. However, the study did find that for the learning of Hebrew, the larger the class size, the better the results. There are various explanations to do this. I won't go into it today. The third study was done in 2011 by the Center for American Progress, and the results I thought were particularly insightful and shed light on the results of the 2 studies I just mentioned and just cited. This US study observed that smaller class sizes was a popular idea. But after tens of billions of dollars were spent across states, particularly in California and Florida, it did not affect results in a statistically significant way. One reason was that in the US's context, smaller class sizes meant hiring of many new teachers who were inexperienced and yet to be effective in the class. The report said, quote, "The evidence on class size indicates that smaller classes can, in some circumstances, improve student achievement if implemented in a focused way. But class size reduction policies generally take exactly the opposite approach by pursuing across-the-board reduction. They are also extremely expensive and represented wasted opportunities to make smarter educational investments." When I was in Finland earlier this year, I visited a secondary school. Finland has a very good education system, and I asked the teachers for their opinion on class sizes. They told me this. They say there are different political parties in Finland, and each one has a position on the class size, and they all have different class sizes. And whoever is elected will then legislate that class size and put it into law. And the teachers said that we'd rather not have that rigidity. Grant the school the teaching resources. Give them the flexibility to configure class sizes for different groups of students for different subjects. And this is what Singapore has been doing. Let me summarize. Earlier generations of Singaporeans have worked hard to uplift lives, and education plays a major role. But success creates new problems. The doubts of many Singaporeans, whether meritocracy still works, whether inequality is worsening, are paradoxically the results of our policies succeeding and improving the lives of Singapore families. That is why I said tackling inequality is unfinished business. But I stress there is no contradiction between meritocracy and fairness, nor reducing inequality and raising our collective standards. Instead, we should double up on meritocracy, broaden its definition to embrace various talents and skills. We should not cap achievement at the top, but try harder, work harder to lift the bottom. I wanted to set out these fundamentals because it is important to have broad agreement around them. If we have, we are in a much better position to develop the education system to better prepare our children for the future. As to what exactly we need to do in terms of programs, initiatives, policy reviews, MOE will take in all the views and suggestions raised inside and outside of this house and consider them. Some we will implement. Some may take time to implement. Others involve trade-offs, and we may decide not to implement them for time being. Speaker asked 2 questions. He asked, this Deputy Speaker. Speaker, while he was here, asked 2 questions. He asked, what is the most important school you attend? Who are our most important teachers? And my answer is this: the most important school is our family. The most important teacher, our parents. Of course, it takes a village to raise a child, but the home and the parents is one of the most important education experience all of us will have. But it also makes, so you imagine if a family is a school and the parent is the teacher, it makes the job of MOE complicated. Because between the parent and the child is a complex relationship. And all of us who are parents, we know that. There's expectations, love, respect, hopes, fears, worries, all complex relationship, and MOE is in the middle of it. But it also means that being an educator is a great privilege because you get to educate a child, which is the most cherished, valuable to the parents, which is why Mr. Darrell David is not here, which is why Mr. David mentioned that being a teacher is unlike all other professions, unlike a lawyer or a pilot where nobody questions you, how you do your job. But when it comes to the teachers, parents will question, because parents too are the most important teachers to the child. And it's a complex relationship between mother and child, father and child. So there are so many opinions on education because of that. It's so close to our hearts because it affects the closest people in our lives, our children. It also means that discussion on education can be frustrating and sometimes end up in a stalemate. Parents will say, MOE, you better change. MOE sometimes will say, I think parents too, you need to change. Sometimes we point fingers at each other. The children don't say this, they look at you and say, I think both of you better change. The truth is, we are all in this together as partners to build a better future. I feel optimistic and hopeful because through all the speeches made today, we may appear like we have different views, but I think underlying all that, there's consensus on the direction ahead. I don't think we ever had such a strong chorus of voices in the House, emphasizing on the importance of joy of learning, cautioning against excessive tuition, and relentless chasing of academic results. I believe this is a view that will reverberate beyond this chamber. MOE and all our partners, we will work together. It's not an easy job, but MOE with the resources and the policy levers, we will be the initiator of changes. We can be the system integrator. Work together, bring about improvements and change. All of us cannot fail the young people of Singapore, and we cannot fail our society. Mr. Speaker, Deputy Speaker, I support the motion.